Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So I'm just, precisely because that Siberian book has appeared, that makes me free, I think, to go back and resume fieldwork in tribal India. And this is the stage when I could do most with your help in checking whether I'm really along useful lines. The last time I was talking in this room, I think, must have been about 25 years ago. And since then, I've brought up my own children, and I've watched my parents grow old and start fading away. So this is an example of how our fieldwork comes home to find a place in our personal lives too. And as one gets older, I think the mysteries of remembering and forgetting get even more mysterious, and so does their emotional power. So in anthropology, as elsewhere, I suppose forgetting is not received as much attention as remembering. And authors who reflect on this point to the topic's residual default status. Remembering is privileged over forgetting, retention and stability are privileged over loss and change. So most of their classifications distinguish more or less deliberate or intentional forgetting from unintentional forgetting, voluntary remembering, deliberate forgetting, preferring to forget bad memories, and so on. Well, now all these analyses are helpful, but in their concern with classifying the logic of the process, they often downplay the force of emotion, and thus of motive or intentionality. So I want to explore this in the aggressively intentional forgetting of the dead among the Sora, who, as Alan said, are an Aboriginal tribe in India, who have been on the margin of Hinduism for centuries, maybe millennia, and whose younger generations are now converting from shamanism to baptism. And I'll look at two moments in the lives of Pilanto and Eranti, whom I've known since they were young in the 1970s, and you'll find their names on your handout. Pilanto was a little boy and he became a Baptist. Eranti was a teenage girl and she became a shaman. Now Pilanto was the son of my first Sora friend and host called Inama. And when I eventually set up my own hut, Inama gave me Pilanto as an adopted son to live in my hut and keep me company. So first, let me just show you who everybody looked like in the 1970s, who we all were. Could we have the first photo, please? And lights, please. This is Pilanto here, as he was when I first knew him. Next, please. This is his father, Inama, holding another of his children. This is Eranti, as she was in her late teens. This is her elder sister, Gadlanti, and we'll meet her as well. And here are the two of them preparing a ritual. So Eranti was just learning to be a shaman, and she was learning from her older sister under her tutelage. Next one. That was me as Pilanto and all these people first knew me.
Can we have it again?
Right. And just so that you know who I was in those days. And can we just go to the last one, the colour one? That's right. This is a shamaness. We won't have time to know her, but it's just an example of she's fallen into trance and she is just on the path at that moment. She is encountering poisonous centipedes and nasty snakes and things blocking her path to the underworld, and that's why, if you look carefully, you can see some tears flowing from her eyes. She's having a struggle on the path to the underworld, and I will talk later about the struggle of the path to the underworld. Thank you. Lights, please. So in the early 1990s, I returned to Soraland after many years' absence. And in the meantime, my friend Inama had died. But I hadn't known this, and I hadn't sent a sacrificial buffalo for him to eat in the underworld. But even if I had sent a buffalo, he wouldn't have received it, since his son Pilanto, like most of his generation, had become a Baptist. Pilanto was now grown up, a pillar of the church with children of his own. He had not cremated his father, not planted a megalithic memorial stone, and not engaged him in dialogue through the mouth of a shaman in trance. So though his father had not been a Christian, Pilanto had given him a Christian burial. And on that trip, in the last few minutes before I was due to leave, I found myself alone with Pilanto in the darkened hut where we had all lived together all those years ago. And I asked him, "Where do you think your father is now?" And he replied, "Well, he may be up in the sky with Jesus, or he may be down in the underworld with our ancestors. How can we know? We don't talk to them anymore." And then suddenly, and quite unexpectedly, he flung his arms round my shoulder and started crying. And in the paired phrasing of traditional Sora song, he sobbed, "You're going to a far place, you're going to a distant place. You're going where I can't feed you rice, you're going where I can't pour you water." Now this was the format and the sentiment of the old shamanist funeral lament, which Pilanto had not uttered when his father had died. Yet something about that moment made it possible for him to utter those words now, maybe even made it necessary. Years ago I had gone away, he assumed never to return. And now after his father's death I had reappeared and was about to go away again, perhaps forever. In my departure, was his father dying a second time? Then the moment was over. A crowd of friends and relatives burst into the hut to wave me off, including Pilanto's own little boy, who instead of receiving the name of his dead grandfather was called Livingstone. He looked just like Pilanto's father, but this child had never conversed with his grandfather, alive or dead. Well, religious change must be one of the major stories of our species. It's closely linked with culture contact, and in recent millennia with the spread of empires. And history contains many accounts of rapid conversions from local beliefs to the religions of powerful outsiders. I mean, we can think of the globalization of the Mediterranean in the late Roman Empire, the Vikings of Iceland who supposedly became Christians in the year 1000, or the medieval Mongol Khan who switched his people to Buddhism after inviting missionaries, I think they were Taoist, Buddhist and Catholic, to compete in a theological debate. That moment with Pilanto reveals the pain and dislocation which these simple stories mask. And it's that moment that I'm trying to understand. And other similar moments when a young Christian child of a dead friend of my own age has displayed a sudden, uncontrolled and incomplete fragment of shamanist mourning behavior. Anthropologists often use a moment as a device on which to hang an analysis. For example, a man rubs his bottom on his nephew, and the result is Bateson's Narvin. And as the foundation of an analysis, it works because we can take the event as typical, in a situation which is taken as not particularly changing. But the untypical moment can also be revealing, especially in the process of change. And in the worldwide conversion from local religions to evangelical Christianity, these moments can be poignant, like Michelle Rosaldo's Ilongot friends who cry when she plays them a tape of an old headhunting song. Or it can be catastrophic. You may know Tuzin's account of how the men expose their secret men's cult as a fraud one Sunday morning in church because he's written a letter to say he's coming to revisit them. For the Sora, at least, I believe that loving and forgetting are helpful ideas for getting to the heart of what's going on. Pilanto loved his father, but he also has to forget him, and his tears are a sign of a difficulty he has in accomplishing this under the transition from a shamanism to a Christianity. So, for anthropologists, as for the people we study, remembering is closely linked to the dead. And techniques of memorializing the dead especially focus on material things. Their design, their very materiality often seem intended to prevent forgetting. Yet even the most interactive objects are ultimately relatively passive. An object can have agency. But for all the vigor of, say, Gell's canoe prows, how far can these objects argue or negotiate or be persuaded to change their mind? Well, the Sora quickly dismiss everything material about the dead, everything physical. Cremation reduces the body to ashes, which are buried immediately. An upright memorial stone is planted alongside the many dozens representing previous members of the patrilineage, and women fall lamenting upon the stone as if they were actually embracing the dead person. But within a matter of weeks, nobody can remember which stone is whose. And after the big day, the stone is no longer a focus of mourning, and it will never again receive any ritual or emotional attention. And it will never again ask for it. Though the dead frequently demand our attention, they don't do this through their memorial stones. Instead, the dead person will repeatedly borrow the bodies and voices of shamans in trance in order to speak in dialogues with the living. As you would expect, this dialogic approach is reflected in the Sora vocabulary for remembering the dead, and I put a bit of vocabulary on your handouts there. The word most used when thinking about a dead person is the verb olong, meaning to greet, to engage, to talk to. And I translated Pilanto's remark as, we don't talk to them anymore, but what he actually said is, we don't olong them anymore. The dead are remembered and forgotten in terms of your verbal encounters with them, in which olong works in dialectic with its opposite, omda, meaning to let go, dismiss, release. So the process of remembering and forgetting the dead is cast in a relational vocabulary of engagement and disengagement. At each ritual the dead are summoned, olonged, and omdad, dismissed. But they'll be back. You'll talk to various lineups of the same dead people again and again, when they make you ill, when you offer them first fruits, when they call you over to talk at somebody else's ritual. And what you're remembering is not simply a person, but a relationship. This relationship is still evolving because you and all the living and dead people you know are still evolving by means of your interaction with each other. And it's this interaction, this involvement and process, which I shall call loving. Of course, this is not the romantic attachment of lovers, but it's attachment and loss in the context of dying. Some anthropologists argue for the idea of a culture's key emotions, such as the passion, the liget of Rosaldo's Ilongot. And Robert Levy calls these hyper-cognized emotions. For the Sora, I think attachment and loss are not so much emotions in themselves as the enabler for a gamut of emotions which may include anger, resentment, guilt, as much as tenderness. A notion of love as complex as that of psychoanalysis, and I think strikingly similar. A key term here is sinta, a verb which means both to feel sorry for someone and to miss them. And this word emphasizes an identification or shared state, which is appropriate, since the pity we feel for our dead is linked to sharing the pain of their illness and death. The word for pity, abasuyum, means literally a feeling which makes you ill, sympathy, in the old Greek sense of suffering the same suffering. And this pity is partly spontaneous, partly coerced. When you fall ill, this is because a dead person who loves you has started to absorb your soul, causing identical symptoms in you. You offer them a sacrificial animal as a substitute. If they accept the substitute, you recover. And if not, you die and join them. So I'd like to show you a crowd of people olonging the dead. You'll see the shaman's soul going on a journey to visit their spirit spouse in the underworld, which leaves their body free for a succession of dead people to speak. And I'll talk more about the shaman later. In this particular film, it just so happens that the more prominent shaman is a man working alongside a junior woman. But it'll be important to remember later that most of the great shamans are women. Can we have the first film clip, please? Lights. Thanks. No, we need to go to the beginning of that clip. This thing here. Shh. Try again. Okay. Sound? You're missing some great drumming. There's a volume switch. The sound's rather important.
Shut the sound. You have to go down to the volume. It's muted, it says.
We'll be talking about muteness later, but we need the sound now.
If you go to the bottom right hand corner, there's a little icon you can see. Do you have any PC experts around there?
The bottom right hand corner.
Look, everybody over this side of the room knows exactly what to do.
Yeah, that one there. Click on that. Yeah.
Double click.
Right. Can we go to the beginning of this clip, please? We need to go back to the beginning of the clip. Right. Because the drumming is what calls the dead up from the world. And the dancing. It causes the dead to come. This is the great shaman in the purple shirt. So now he's in trance and dead people have come up through him to talk to the mourners. That is the lament format that I was talking about before. And now the dead person is speaking very forcefully. That's the other shaman. Okay, thanks. Right. Can we stop that one? Okay. Well, what are they saying? It's sometimes possible to tape record dialogues in the midst of all that noise, and on your handout you'll find one typical example of a little girl who's just died. The vocabulary and syntax are exactly the same as in conversations where all the speakers are living. So unless you were told, you couldn't work out from the text or the intonation whether a speaker was alive or dead. The little girl's mother is too overcome with grief to talk, so the girl is alonged by her aunt. And I'll just give you a moment to look through that. Notice the girl's guilt trip in the first half of the text, which turns into the threat of repeated illness in the last few lines, which go over the page. I think so, yeah. Sorry. Any more handouts needed? Can you pass them back? Thanks. By now, I think it'll be obvious that this is a culture dedicated to verbal articulacy, and especially to the ability to argue your own position within the emotional tangle of loving. Indeed, the girl's emotional demands shows that this is a highly prescriptive system enforced through the shamans, if not by them. Everyone has to talk like this because this is how one talks to the dead. The dead crave acknowledgement, and by making us ill, they keep tugging at us to attract our attention. In dialogues, they phone in from around the cosmos to tell us their current location, which is linked, of course, to a classification of spirits and illnesses, their corresponding emotional state, and as a consequence, their intentions towards us, such as here the transmission of leprosy. When a dead person makes us ill, this may be from a mixture of love and anger, plus feelings of sinta on both sides, missing each other. But whatever motives the divination throws up, we're being brought into a shared parallel state with the dead. To regulate this, we enjoy good memories together, but we also defend ourselves against their accusations and their guilt trips. Any over-identification with the dead must be broken, and we must become separate once again. And so the structure of every ritual involves, as I said, summoning the dead, allonging them, but afterwards finally undying them. Now this vocabulary in itself doesn't contain any reference to time. Rather, it provides a framework for a dynamic between remembering and forgetting. Dialogue has pace built into it through stages of emotional tone. It's in their early painful experiences that the dead are at their most intense, as the shaman reproduces their speech habits and gestures with uncanny realism. And what you saw in that film there was recently dead people talking. And the little girl responds to the mood of her mother by accusing her, in words which echo what we might call the mother's own self-reproach. If only I'd realised how ill you were, if only I'd been kinder. And this unhappiness among the living is matched by the girl's inclination to pass on her illness to her family, causing further deaths. She's begged by her aunt not to perpetuate her own suffering onto others. This is not because she's a nasty person, indeed she's childishly innocent. Rather, as the girl herself says, this is what recently dead people do. Every illness or death is caused by somebody close who previously suffered from the same condition. And it's the mourner's fresh feeling of pity, of abasuyum, that makes them share the dead person's sense of suffering, and so makes them susceptible to her illness. So the cruel realism of the early dialogues reflects this shared vulnerability, but it also opens up the possibility of redemption. In repeated dialogues over the following months and years, living and dead speakers persuade, cajole, tease, remind, deceive each other in their attempts to uncover each other's state of mind and to change it. So this is a dialectic of resolution. As ambivalences and resentments between them are negotiated, the dead are liberated from the pain of their death, just as the living are freed from guilt and grief. With those who've been dead for a long time, there's nothing significant left to discuss, and the emotional tone of their dialogues is casual, even flippant. So this particular girl will gradually acknowledge that her family did their best to save her, and will allow the living to coax her away from the bad company of other leprosy victims and into the good company of her lineage ancestors. And she will gradually turn into an ancestor herself, and her influence on her family will become benign. So by that stage, instead of causing illness, she'll start passing her soul force into their crops and into every mouthful they consume. For this is a cyclical cosmos, and when the grief is over, the dead are also the source of new life. And we'll see in a moment that this completion of the cycle is exactly what's missed in Christian rhetoric, which sees only the demands and the coercion. So this process of mourning will be complete when the girl announces that she intends to give her name to a new baby in the family. And the naming ceremony will repeat the tunes and drum beats of the funeral which you saw, but with a striking emotional difference. At the centre of the stomping dancers, amidst the shrieks of laughter and obscene horseplay, there will be nobody weeping. And even further into the future, when this process is complete, this little girl will die a second time in the underworld and turn into a butterfly. Butterflies are the lonely residue of persons. They're beyond the reach of dialogue. They're people who don't quite cease to exist, but about whom nothing can be known because there's no one left alive to remember them. Butterflies are memories without rememberers. So loving has a trajectory which follows the shape of time itself. Cosmic time is also therapeutic time, and both are experienced and managed through the articulacy of dialogues between the living and the dead. An ancestor is a dead person who has moved beyond ambivalent love to a love which is purely nurturing. A butterfly is a former ancestor who has moved beyond relationality altogether. In the 1970s, which is when those photos date from, in my fascination with shamans, I seriously underestimated the scale or speed of the coming Baptist conversion. This was my own weakness because the signs were certainly there. India was starting to grow into a superpower, and the arms of the state were reaching into the country's remote tribal frontier in a complete reversal of the protectionist, isolationist approach inherited from the British. As I arrived, the government was chasing the Canadian Baptist missionaries out of the area, but they had sown a seed, as they might have put it, which was eagerly cultivated by certain Sora. But now I think I can see that this change is not about Christianity as such, because neighbouring Sora regions are converting to fundamentalist Hinduism, which is another parallel story I can't go into here. Rather, I think this hardening is about Sora identity and the terms on which they will enter the new technocratic Indian project of nation building. It's the local fallout from globalization. Instead of engaging with the spirit sights they pass every few meters on their own landscape, neo-Hindu Soras strive to find their place in the nationalist cosmology of ancient epic revival. It now turns out that when Rama and Sita lived in exile in the jungle, they were looked after by Soras. While Baptists make a meticulous Sunday school study of the geography of ancient Palestine. So we used to have this joke, because I'm half Jewish, that I knew more than they did about their ancestors, but they knew more than I did about my ancestors. The old-timers drank and danced and laughed and huddled under the protection of their shaman spirit familiars. These spirits represented the old Sora way of dealing with the outside world. They were high-caste Kshatriya Hindu spirits, Rajas, policemen, clerks, people who knew how to read and write and could speak Oriya. It was these spirits who married the Sora shamans in the underworld, cutting across the shamans' ordinary marriage above ground and giving them the power to trance. They even begat spirit children by their shamans, and these children were themselves high-caste Hindus who would initiate the shaman's successor by marrying her in turn. But these high-status spirits were the flip side of a distressing Hindu contempt for tribals in ordinary life. In seeking a place in this outer world, young Christians turn this contempt inward on their parents. And despite my white race, my involvement with the old shamanism, my jungly habits, and my earthy language sometimes made me feel that I'm included, still do. So the next generation show up in government offices with sleek down hair, white trousers, white shirts, and shoes, and are offered a chair. We used to be treated like dogs, but during the last election campaign, the Raja of Palakimadi himself dined in our church. So the biblical commandment to honour thy father and mother conflicts with the scramble to achieve social and economic advancement. Their parents' economy, burning out their bodies on jagged mountainsides to raise scanty Neolithic crops and dying at 40. Their hardened feet cracked from clambering over abrasive rocks. Their lanky shanks exposed through tattered loincloths as they stand obsequiously seeking an audience with disdainful officials. Their awe at the snatches of garbled Oriya uttered by their shaman spirit husbands. To their children who write Oriya at school, wear smart clothes and fix their eyes on government jobs, all of these can only appear pathetic. So in this new religion, one relates to other people in a very different way. For example, you scarcely participate with your body at all. Just remember how tactile that dialogue with the dead was. In church, men sit cross-legged on the right while women sit on the left, knees bent to one side and coloured saris drawn over their heads. The women don't cuddle or sprawl affectionately across each other, but avoid contact even among themselves. Their small children are not bounced up and down on an adult's waist in a throbbing crowd of mixed male and female dancers, but are drawn into their mother's modest, subdued behaviour. And you don't participate much with your voice, either. Baptism introduces new speech forms, the prayer, the hymn, the sermon. And the sermon in particular amounts to a new kind of performance, in which one does not speak but is spoken to. Instead of squatting on the floor in dialogue with the dead through a female shaman, we're subjected to monologic teachings and exhortations by male pastors from a platform above our heads. And this speech is uttered in a new haranguing intonation, sometimes mediated through loudspeakers, which of course emphasizes that you have no right of reply. So, instead of a series of healing conversations with his father, Pilanto was offered a pastor's monologue at the graveside. Previously, parents' need to talk was matched by an equal need in their children. Now, parents anticipate reaching out for dialogue but getting no response. And this is a new reason why the older Sora are afraid to die. Christians, and their parents, die mute. A person's name and the date of their birth and death are scraped into the fresh cement of a Christian grave, and their photo is often pinned up in the house. These customs make use of newly available technologies, but I can't help feeling that the materiality and the personalization of the photo and the cement flow into a vacuum left by the disappearance of dialogue. And I would just like to show you a monologic scene. So can we go to the beginning of the second film clip? Lights, please. Can we have the haranguing voice as well? I don't know if you... It's all the same. It's basically how God is displeased with us. Yeah, okay. Sorry, can you turn that one off again? Yeah. Okay, lights on again. Sorry, that clip was shorter than it was meant to be because we couldn't find the beginning, but I think you get the message. You're all being quiet and not answering back, so I'm sure you're all Christians. In the handout, I've given you a hymn written by that pastor, Pastor Matthew, and I've included the Sora original so that you can recognize these key words of giving up and abandoning, which I've underlined, and they're in your vocabulary at the beginning of the thing. This vocabulary of giving up and abandoning is important. And you notice the sort of thing you're meant to give up, which is a bizarre mixture of wine and tobacco, of course, anger and pride, but also horseplay, joking, and funeral megaliths. So all these bad things, Pastor Matthew explained to us, come from our ancestors, just like sacrifice and robbery and murder. So all these old-timers giggling and playfulness are on the same level as the 7 deadly sins. And we can see that words like omda are no longer part of a process of transforming or redeeming the dead, but are used to repudiate them. So the indigenous Baptist church has become more militant than the missionaries, whom I remember as being sort of prissy but fairly sweet old ladies. Accurately identifying the key means of communication with the spirits, all the actions and the transactions which parallel dialogue, in order to suppress them. The obvious one is animal sacrifice, as Pastor Matthew said, and the other is alcohol, and I was always a bit puzzled why alcohol, why this extreme obsessive ban. Well, obviously it's a key way of communicating with the ancestors. And I used to say, well, surely Jesus enjoyed alcohol too. You know, no, of course not. So I finally looked through the New Testament at all the points where wine is mentioned, and it's always translated as fruit juice. So at the wedding of Cana, people say, most people serve the best fruit juice first, but you say first. And in the book of Revelations, the whores of Babylon are fornicating under the influence of fruit juice. So that was my answer. I'm very struck by the completely different role of silence from the reindeer herding peoples of Siberia, whose discretion and taciturnity seem to lie at the heart of all their various cultures. And I have a student in the field now who's living with a group who are subject to Baptist conversion. And he reports that they're developing a new kind of articulacy, a torrent of conversion narrative, a performing of the sincerity of their new Christian personhood. But Sora Baptists demonstrate their correctness by keeping quiet in the face of God. Instead of the olong style used for talking to your dead mates, they address God by praying, which translates into Sora humiliatingly as begging speech. And the form of prayer is simple. Thank you for providing everything, which previously was provided by our ancestors, whom we no longer believe in. And there's no need for an exchange of information. Lord God, what can I tell you? You know what a sinner I am. You know everything about me. So I want to go back to Pilanto, whom I showed you as a child and told you about some 20 years later, and whom I met again last year. This repudiation of the dead doesn't happen only between generations. For many, it happens within their own lifespan. And this is why Pilanto could still understand my question, where is your father, and take it seriously. And his answer contained the following points. Firstly, I don't know where he is, which we now know also means I don't know how he is. But this is precisely what dialogue would have allowed him to monitor blow by blow, as he goes on to explain when he says, "This is because I don't along him." And then transferring his lost engagement with his father onto me, he adds, "You're going far away where I can't feed you." And we now know that this is part of a much wider relationship, and I think a transferal onto me of his feelings about his father. So I believe that this moment reveals that Pilanto is confused, firstly about how he feels, and secondly about how to express how he feels. So first let's take how he feels. Pilanto has become uncertain how key emotional words like Sinta actually work for him. You remember Sinta means I feel sad for someone, I miss them, and so on. I long for them. And shamanists and Christians have completely opposed views of how this works. The shamanists say that holding dialogues with the dead cools your Sinta, that means eases it and diminishes it. And this is what Pilanto used to say. But last year he told me, "I don't talk to my father because it would make me feel sad. If we talk again and again, the Sinta doesn't go away." So in saying this, he's ignoring the later stages in which Sora ritual sets verbal articulacy to work, to harness sad and illness-causing memories in order to make you well again. So such Christians are interpreting remembering the dead not as a dynamic process, which evolves along with the relationship on which it is based, but as a pointless repetition involving a relationality which is entirely negative. So the emotionality of young people born Christian often seems to me to be inscrutable, and I haven't really worked out a way of reaching this. But for some of those who've made the change themselves and whom I've known closely, I think I can glimpse how the Baptists' removal of progression and relationality leaves their memories of the dead unresolved. Pilanto has a recurrent dream in which he sees his father with a group of dancers on a path which leads down an abyss into the underworld. Above them rises a path to a gate in the sky, and his father is dancing with his friends, oblivious to his son and out of reach of any longing. Pilanto is unsure about the value of these paths. One time the upper path is easier, so he feels his father should avoid the lower one. Another time the upper path seems too difficult, so that his father will inevitably go down below. And I suspect the variants of this dream pick up the pagan path to the underworld and blend it with contradictory currents in the Christian message. My way is easy versus the eye of the needle, which means my way is difficult. Matthew 7:13. Then how to express his feelings. Pilanto has also become uncertain about how to handle the verbal link between feeling and expressing. His confusion reflects his unsettled position in a much broader ideological conflict which flows like a tide through his life as through everyone else's. In Christian company there is no acceptable arena or discourse to express uncertainty about his father's state. This is something that has become unsayable, but it's clearly not unfeelable. And it's because he feels something that Pilanto makes an attempt to say it. In doing so, he can only fall back on a severed fragment of a previous cultural repertoire, a genre which still somehow matches the way he feels. The reason he says it to me, I think, is that he identifies me with his father. But I'm sure it's also because I still share this cultural repertoire. Well, what is it that Pilanto is articulating? What kind of utterance is he making? One kind of answer might be that he's trying to express an emotion which exists within. And the anthropology of emotion has explored emotion words and debated the universality or incommensurability of their reference. Love, anger, sadness, there are whole books about these. And though they go on to develop subtle arguments about the context and deployment of these words, this discourse still ultimately gives us an emotional economy of nouns, and it's constrained by their nouniness. It has difficulty in dealing with emotional ambiguity, indeterminacy, and changeability. So what if we want to focus not on the supposed identity or essence of emotions, but on their fluidity and their mutability? This is precisely what the pagan Sora do. The Sora language has nouns for emotions, but they are used in ways which make their reference interpersonal rather than internal. I feel love, anger, etc. with you, or because, followed by a predicate which draws the focus away from the noun towards the unfolding relational scenario in which it's enmeshed. Such emotional utterances are akin to what a historian called William Reddy calls emotives. I came across an article in Current Anthropology from 1997 called Against Constructionism, the Historical Ethnography of Emotions. So though he still buys into emotions as nouns, Reddy is clear that emotional utterances are not simply descriptive reports of an inner state. Rather than constructing emotion, he argues that his emotives channel and orchestrate emotional expression. Certain conventional emotives can be authorized in a given community, and as the Sora show us, this authority can come to an end too. Most interestingly, Reddy offers a theory of emotional change. In the very process of being uttered, such utterances can change our emotions. Thus, changes in emotional utterances reveal actual emotional change. It's a sort of Heisenberg theory of emotion. The pagan Sora have anticipated Reddy and have already gone further by using emotion verbs far more than nouns. Rather than an indexing of emotions with an implied correspondence between word and inner state, pagan Sora offer us a dynamics of emotionality, and this is the point of articulacy, I think. In Sora dialogues with the dead, emotion is articulation. What one expresses is not a single named emotion, but the flux of emotionality. And the scenarios through which this emotionality flows are constantly shifting dramas. They evolve developmentally, as does the emotionality of all the participants. And the entire process is managed, indeed driven, by dialogue. And the moods that they pass through have no names, and I think we can infer them only by noticing the shifts of emotional tone, which tend to correspond to stages of mourning. So emotional utterances now appear as crystallized moments of emotional intensity in a universe which runs on verbal articulacy. Well, one might expect that the shift to baptism would introduce new ways of articulating emotionality, but I want to argue that so far at least, the change has produced a diminution of articulacy, and that this is having a knock-on effect not only of changing emotionality, but of restricting it. Certainly the pastors are fluent in their sermonizing, but this is an altogether new way of relating to language. Even where it substitutes for the ancestors by covering topics of emotion, morality, eschatology, it's still not a negotiated discourse, and the congregation remains conspicuously passive. The Baptist removal of the dialogic style of emotional expression means that the muteness surrounding the relationship between living and dead Christians is a new kind of emotional muteness. I believe that Pilanto's few lines of lament, quickly abandoned, are an attempt at filling in for this muteness. The Sora lament is not just a rhetorical declamation, but a prelude to a two-sided engagement. It's structured in the expectation of a response, and invites the dead person to emerge and enter into a dialogue, as sure enough they always do. Christians do sometimes lament, but without expecting a response. They have a continuity of form with a change of function or meaning. And Pilanto had not even done this when his father died. Years later, at his unplanned, unritualized moment with me, he achieved a few lines of lamentation, which I think are the first he had ever uttered for his father. But he could go no further. So in asking him where his father was, I posed the question in terms of cosmology, where is he? But his reply moved quickly from cosmology through cognition to engagement. I don't know where he is because we don't along him. His tears, his embrace, and his lament fold all of these idioms, cosmology, cognition, and engagement, into an effort to articulate something inchoate. Not a mere noun, I'm sure, but a striving to match up feeling with expression, a fragment of a procedure for grasping and inflecting and steering it. So now I'm going to introduce you to this young shamaness whom I knew when she was a girl. Pilanto's lament is an utterance of a very particular sort, an impeded utterance, an attempt at articulacy in a context where this is no longer welcome, and in a format which no longer works. So I'd like to look more closely at impedance by comparing his blocked lament with two other moments when someone falls into an inarticulacy which is likewise temporary, but this time total. And this will also allow us to go beyond a layman and look directly at the shaman as a virtuoso facilitator of other people's emotional articulacy. The first brief moment is a moment with a non-shaman. In December 2005, I walked unannounced into a Sora village where I used to live, and went straight to the house of an old pagan friend who had died. The first person I met was his daughter, a young woman in Christian dress. The girl grasped my hand and squeaked uncontrollably for a full minute before running away and hiding in embarrassment. This was not the impeded articulacy of Pilanto, which led to a partial performance of a lament. It was a moment, quite a long one, of complete inarticulacy. I was to see another moment of inarticulacy a few days later, in a gathering of shamans. For administrative reasons, I could not stay long in the Sora Mountains, so I sent messages to invite 5 shamans to join me in a cement house in the plains. To my amazement, these women all trekked down the mountainside and turned up 2 days later. The setting was unsympathetic, but away from the disapproving gaze of their Baptist children, though of course not of the Jungle Telegraph later, they quite unexpectedly started taking it into turns to go into trance and summon my old friends to along me. I should say a word about how a shaman works. It may be that she gets some personal fulfillment from helping her clients, like a therapist, but I've never heard anyone say this. Instead, they dwell elaborately on the journey to the underworld and their domestic life there with their alternative family, their spirit husband and children. The experience of this path is said to be exquisitely beautiful, the beauty suffused with the terror of leaping down precipices and facing monsters. As the shaman clambers down to the underworld, her soul becomes a monkey. She overcomes fearful obstacles on the way with the help of her underworld spirits, who sing things like, and that last slide you saw, at that very moment they were singing, "Let us show you, let us guide you. Poisonous snakes on the path, my love. Venomous centipedes on the path, my love. You're dazed with fear, you're rooted to the spot. Come to us, my darling. Reach out to us, my darling." There are special stories attached to each of the women who turned up in this house, and I wish I had time to tell you about them. 3 of them were friends from the same village. 2 of them the sisters I showed you at the beginning, Eranti and her sister Gatlanti. And the third one is, I would say, the last of the truly great shamans, though she endures pressure from her embarrassed Christian children and her jealous husband. My husband says I'm being promiscuous in the underworld, but that's just his excuse for having affairs with other women up here. Gatlanti, the elder of those 2 sisters, told me this time, "My husband made me give up, my children went Christian. But my underworld Christian made me ill, they drove me crazy. And just a few months ago I started doing trances again, and now I don't get ill anymore." And her younger sister, Eranti, whom I will dwell on, had likewise been buffeted between demands of her living family and torment from her neglected spirits. Several years ago she gave up, and she was now estranged from her underworld family. But this occasion was extraordinary in many ways. As the other 2 shamans from her village sat down, legs outstretched across the floor in the trancing position, following the distinctive incantation of their village, invoking their helper spirits in unison, I was puzzled to see Eranti sitting alongside them. Having renounced her spirits, could she be planning to take part? She drew her knees up to her chest again, several times, as if retreating from the possibility of trance. But finally she straightened her legs out along the floor and joined their singing. Teetering at the brink, dizzy at the precipice, don't glance back, don't hesitate. The other 2 women entered trance simultaneously as their souls slipped through the floor and started moving down through the earth. But Eranti's trance had somehow gone wrong. She was out of practice. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she was whimpering wordlessly, at one point sobbing so convulsively that I feared she would choke. The others continued plunging down to the underworld without her. During their silence, during their absence, Eranti finally found her voice and started to gasp out couplets, improvised to the lamentation tune. "Don't block my lovely path, don't block my beautiful road. Will I ever see you again, my darling? Will I ever reach you again, my sweetheart?" And helped by the framework of this formal lament, Eranti started to recover her composure, but still she sat wretched and silent beside her friends until they returned and opened their eyes. Of course, her friends hadn't been silent. All my old friends had been speaking through them for about half an hour. And afterwards she told me, she said, monkeys keep coming to me in dreams. They claw my back, they pinch my bottom, they push me to the beginning of the path. And the very experienced shaman said to her gently, yes, you reached the beginning this time. You could have gone all the way. Yes, perhaps I could. I was astonished. Was I really starting to trance? They hadn't abandoned me after all. My guides, the ones I gave up on, they began to lead me. They didn't scold me. Come back to us, they said. It was so beautiful with us, they said. But I said no. I was frightened. I was ashamed. I even forgot my spirit grandmother's name, so how could I call on her? I just wept. And then her sister advised her, if you simply blub, if you simply snivel, your words come out weak, your words come out garbled. You should say out loud all the things you did together. You should list all the things you miss. And Eranti explained to me, my husband down below caresses me with his words. Come to me, he says. But I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed because I've neglected him. I've got a baby girl down there. Recently I cradled her in a dream. I miss her terribly. I'll just show you a bit of a film of her explaining these things to me. And now that her moment of confusion is over, you notice her fully recovered articulacy. Can we have the last film clip, please? I abandoned them, I was ashamed, I was embarrassed. She's talking about 8 or 9 years since I gave up. So I'm asking, did they scold you? Were they angry with you? No, they longed to welcome me. They started to welcome me. It was beautiful with you, it was lovely. Okay, thanks. You can turn it off. Okay. I have 12 minutes worth of words left. Is that okay? Thanks. I'd like you to draw your attention to 4 aspects of these moments with people. Okay? So I'd like to draw your attention to 4 aspects of these moments with Pilanto and Eranti, and you will find them at the end of your handout. And the first one is their differing experiential certainties about the reality of the spirit world. Most of the time, as a good Baptist, Pilanto convincingly performs his denial of the old cosmology, and perhaps he even feels it. But his moment with me suggests that this is not a stable position. He uses the words maybe, and still has dreams which place his father on alternative, ambiguously evaluated paths. Pilanto has not experienced either the shamanist underworld or the Christian heaven for himself. But Eranti knows the path to the underworld is real. When Pilanto says the path may not exist, she says, it's there but I can't reach it anymore. She's been there frequently, and has left half her life behind her there, perhaps the more satisfying half. Pilanto is not sure whether or not he's neglecting his father, but Eranti says outright, my husband and child are waiting for me down there. Neglecting them makes me feel ashamed. For years, to keep her family above ground, Eranti has performed an indifference to her other family in the underworld, but this has been a pretense. This is not an uncertainty about cosmology or about emotion. Eranti is certain of it all, but the uncertainty which torments her lies elsewhere, in a conflict in her relational obligations. She is denied the right to access this world, to deploy it, to feel it, and to live in its terrifying beauty. In effect, her jealous husband and evangelical children are ordering her to dismiss the greatest joy from her life. This is a repression which is not only emotional, but also aesthetic and political. Secondly, differences in loving and forgetting. The Sora show us how the meaning of emotional utterances should be understood against their position in time. Pre-Christian time is the time of bereavement therapy, which is also the time of lineage continuity and replacement. This is a time which partly follows and partly leads the processes of emotional recovery and social growth. It's a time which can't be hurried. Compared to the Christian transition to heaven, the pagan's progress towards butterflyhood is very lingering, that is, attached to those they've left behind. Its measured pace is directly linked to the dynamics of living memory, which is where the loving, remembering and forgetting goes on. By contrast, Christian salvation time has two contradictory paces. It's simultaneously both instantaneous, the farewell at the funeral, and indefinitely postponed, the second coming. Between the day of the funeral and some point in eternity, Sora Christianity doesn't say much about the middle ground of living memory. And earlier I suggested that the new materiality of Christian family photos and inscriptions on graves might be a substitute for lost dialogue. Now I think we can see that this materiality may also help to fill in a gap in the time span of living memory. So as well as distinguishing types of forgetting on formal criteria, as a lot of the anthropology of forgetting does, intentional, unintentional and so on, the Sora also invite us to distinguish modes of forgetting which may apply to any of these types. These modes may be based on the pace and tone of forgetting, which at least for the Sora seem so closely bound up that they serve to constitute each other. The emotional tone of encounters between the living and the dead is softened over time, just as the mourner's time is paced through this softening. So as Christianity collapses the slow therapeutic time of the shamans, forgetting is becoming militant and impatient. Within the possibilities of intentional forgetting, the ideological militance of Sora Baptists suggests not that forgetting is a failure of remembering, which would be merely a cognitive lapse, but the reverse. Remembering is a failure to forget, which is an ideological lapse. I've been reading some political philosophy which reminds me that intending to forget is logically impossible. And in a Sora situation, we should rather talk about desiring to forget. So much of what I've described might better be called repudiation rather than forgetting. After all, Pastor Matthew's hymn encourages us to remember in detail what we're not supposed to do. But I would add that this repudiation is done with the intention that forgetting will be its byproduct. And this forgetting must be based not on ontological negation, but on negative evaluation backed up by neglect. If you neglect a spirit just a little bit but remain susceptible to it, of course you allow it to come back and make you ill. But if you choose to engage with it altogether, it'll eventually give up and go away. And part of the attraction of Christianity is that it makes you immune to access to induced illnesses. And we can see this shift directly reflected in language usage. The basic vocabulary of disengagement, omda and kadab, which was previously used to dismiss a spirit at the end of a ritual until next time, which might be tomorrow, might be this afternoon, is now used by Baptists to terminate the relationship altogether. And the poles of this shift resemble Bakhtin's distinction between unfinalizing and finalizing discourses. For Bakhtin, unfinalizing discourse is endlessly dialogic, not closed off by the voice of an author in a novel, which is his special interest, the state in politics, or we could add a single god in theology. By contrast, finalizing discourse is monologic, even potentially totalitarian. And we've seen how in Pastor Matthew's hymn, Baptists take the Sora terminology of repeated temporary dismissal, omda, and change its usage to make it a key finalizing term of repudiation. Unfinalizing and finalizing forms of forgetting each entail their own forms of loving. By exploring the Sora emphasis on attachment and loss, we realize that for them, remembering and forgetting the dead belong to the same field as loving them. Through the sympathy or empathy of shared feelings and states, including sharing their sickness, loving someone who has died makes you more like them initially. And to forget them through the structure of funeral rites and sacrifices is to make yourself gradually less like them. That's what constitutes a cure. So to change your mode of forgetting is also to change your mode of loving. Of course, this isn't to change the object of your love. Christians still love their parents, but it's to change the way you love them. Both emotionally and cosmologically, loving is simplified. Those who fail to forget persist in loving in a way which is not only more complicated, but is also becoming obsolete. Remembering the dead now appears as remembering them too much. It's a failure of forgetting. Eranti's cry, "When will I see you?" like Pilanto's sob, "You're going to where I can't feed you," is cast in the previous form of expressing attachment and loss. And the loss is double, since what has been lost is also a way of expressing loss. Many lay Christians seem to finalize successfulully, unlike Pilanto. But for shamans, their deprivation is even greater. Shamans who give up are repeatedly made ill by their neglected spirits. And to make the break final, they would actually have to negotiate a spirit divorce, which is a special ritual. Shamans all over Soraland are being forced to do this, but I've never heard of one who has become a serious Christian, or who has announced that they'd only been pretending. Shamans have become unneeded virtuosos, facilitators of a kind of emotionality which is ceasing to exist. So then I want to talk about forms of inarticulacy. Pilanto gave voice to an impeded utterance, but Eranti's momentary failure of articulacy was an attempt at utterance that was so impeded it was no utterance at all. And this isn't simply a distinction between layperson and shaman. You remember that other Christian girl who squeaked. Rather, both the girl and Eranti are trying to express a feeling for which they lack form, one as a new Christian, the other as a disbarred shaman. The young Christian woman who squeaked had relatively little creative verbal agency, but Eranti's moment of inarticulacy was a profound virtuoso failure. These are not culturally validated silences, as among the nomads in Siberia, who communicate without words so subtly that they sometimes seem telepathic. These Sora moments are not meant to be silent. They are moments when conspicuous articulation is required, but fails. There are degrees to this failure. Pilanto's was a mild form, which came out as a brief snatch of lament, which he knew could not be answered by dialogue. At that moment, Pilanto's longing for a response was particularly exposed, and my role as addressee, I think, was to provide at least a hint of that response. Eranti's moment of inarticulacy is quite different. Her sister can only advise her to handle her feelings through the traditional outlet of articulation. You should say out loud all the things you did together. You should list all the things you miss. This advice tells Eranti nothing she doesn't already know, and in the end she did indeed find her voice only by reverting to the conventional format of lamentation. But what of that moment before she found her voice again? Here was a kind of feeling which the format of lamentation has perhaps never before been called upon to express. Eranti's moment of inarticulacy expresses an unprecedented form of loss, the loss of her ability to enter trance, without having undergone a spirit divorce, and while still remembering, loving and longing. She's exposed to the extent of her loss because she's being offered an extraordinary and unexpected opportunity to revisit the underworld. If it's true, as Reddy argues, that historical changes in emotion can be traced by examining changes in emotive utterances, then we can take his argument one step further. It's not only through changes in emotional utterances that we can trace changes in emotionality. In this highly verbalizing culture, we can also see this in a change to an inability to utter. That is, in the emergence of new forms of inarticulacy. These moments of inarticulacy rise under new emotion scenarios which lack a matching expressive format. The people who experience them are caught by surprise. They don't have a new form of expression polished and ready to perform. At that moment, no existing form of expressivity can work. So Pilanto and Eranti are caught in transitional scenarios of loss, which create transitional formats of inarticulacy. Because these transitions are historical, these scenarios, I suspect, may have only a brief historical life. And I think we can identify at least three kinds of scenarios here. Some feelings can no longer be articulated, as in Pilanto's frustrated desire to olong his father. Some feelings cannot yet be articulated. The abruptness of the Christian farewell to the dead perhaps betrays that they haven't yet worked out a comfortable procedure for pacing their forgetting. I suppose this may change. And finally, some feelings may never be articulated, as with Eranti's sudden realization that she may no longer be capable of entering trance even when she tries. This moment of history, indeed her entire life, may pass away without a corresponding expressive format ever coming into being. As probably in many ancient conversions, like Iceland 1007 years ago, this form will leave the historian with no trace. Under the limited horizons of the next generation's new certainties, these transitional scenarios and forms will probably no longer occur. Most young Sora already have no idea what it is in the old culture they have forgotten, beyond a second-hand pastiche about devil worshippers walking in darkness. The erasure of the dead is rapidly becoming fully internalized. We might call this rejection or repudiation. But the fact that people will no longer know that this has happened, well, that's the ultimate forgetting. As well as forgetting what it is they've forgotten, these people have already forgotten the fact that they have forgotten it. This is the fulfillment of a new principle, that children's destinies do not repeat those of their parents, a denial of the pagan model of transgenerational continuity and repetition. The parents exercised elaborate agency by manipulating the nuances of an inward-looking psychology of intimate relations. Their shaman's Hindu helper spirits domesticated an intimidating outside world in which the Sora had no agency in ordinary life. Their children, born Christian without reflection or point of comparison, have transposed their agency from this intimate realm into the feared world of officials and traders by joining them. They move around this newly inhabitable world with a radically simplified theology and psychology. Finally, my role in precipitating these moments. All the moments of impeded articulacy which I have witnessed have been triggered by my own departure or sudden reappearance as a living reminder of a forgotten past, an age mate of dead parents speaking with those parents' archaic metaphors and syntax and intonation. As an anthropologist, I've changed the lives of the people in my fieldwork just as they've changed mine, as I've matured from an impulsive young student to an elder who's addressed as grandfather. My death has been rumoured many times, and these rumours have led to the passing on of my name to several children. But with my malaria tablets and immunisation against so many tropical diseases, I've already outlived most of my Sora friends. I have my own problems of loving and forgetting, my own alternative world of journeys to another realm which I experience as sometimes terrifying, but ultimately of a beauty which I know I'll find nowhere else. In assessing the balance between loss and liberation, how can I regret a new generation's choice? What right do I have to speak for the memory of these young people's parents and grandparents who were my friends? One of the most long-lasting roles an anthropologist can have is as a repository of memory for a community rushing headlong into collective amnesia as their dead become voiceless forever. One could adapt the title of Paul Connaughton's book, How Societies Remember, to read, How Societies Forget, but their anthropologists remember. Among a people who had no writing or photography, I made a collection of notes, photos and tapes, the stories of hundreds of lives which at that time were recorded for my own needs, but which decades later have developed an unforeseen force of their own. My notebooks and my mind have become an archive of passions in which these long-ended lives cry out for dialogue. Whenever I spend time with Pilanto, I sense that he desperately wants something from me, something that I shall surely never be able to give him. One day his descendants may wish to use my notes to reconstruct something of where they came from. This may not happen till long after Pilanto has gone. But if this does happen, it will be at least some reparation for his tears that day we were alone together in his father's hut. Thank you.